Welcome to Chapter 2, Business Statistics, Statistics Methods. And today in Chapter 2, we're going to look at data. Now, data and learning objectives in this chapter identify the context of your data and also distinguish different types of data. Please note that the word data is a plural noun. So always write data are. It's not data is. Datum is the singular. Now, data values or observations are systematically recorded information, whether numbers or labels together with its context. So data could be numbers, names, or labels, and it is useless without understanding the context of it. So the answers of who and what are essential. Right? So data are often organized into a data table like this one. Right? So an example of data with no context, it's impossible to say anything about what these values might mean without knowing their context. A little bit of what we did in the exercise with the first chapter. Right? So keep going. So a row of data in a table corresponds to an individual case about whom or about which if they are not people. So we record some characteristics. And we might collect characteristics such as respondent, individual who answers a survey. So as you know, you already have done this. A subject or participant, person on whom we experiment. And experimental unit, a company, website, or other inanimate subjects. Here is another table, a data table. The variable names are in the top row. Typically, the who of the table are found in the leftmost column, right? Leftmost. So the characteristics recorded above about each individual or case are called variables. So the exercise that you did the other day, it's got to do with variables, height, siblings, such information. These are usually shown as the columns of data table and identify what has been measured. Here is another example of a data table. The variable numbers are in the top row, right there. These are variables. Typically, the who of the table are always found in the leftmost column, as we saw before. Kind of repetitive. Okay. Now, data tables are cumbersome for complex data sets, so often two or more separate data tables are linked together in a relational database. This is what I mentioned to you about Access. Access in Microsoft Access is a database. So each each data table included in the database is a relation because it is about a specific set of cases with information about each of these cases for all or at least most of the variables. Remember what the variables are. Here's an example. A typical relational database is consisting of three relations: customer data, item data, and transaction data. So for example, we can look up a customer to see what items they purchased, or we may look up an item product number to see who purchased it. So a relational database shows all the relevant information from the three separate relations linked by customer and product number, right there. Also, here is the product. A relation data shows all the relevant information from three separately by customer and product IDs. Same thing here. So when you put them together, so a relational database shows all the relevant information from three separate relations linked by customer and product number. Right there. This is an example. Next, we're going to look at variable types. So when a variable names categories or answers questions about how cases fall into those categories, This is called categorical variable, also called qualitative variable. Qualitative stands for quality, qualitative. When a variable has measured numerical values with units and the variable tells us about the quantity of what is measured, it is called a quantitative variable. So we always have qualitative and we have quantitative. Let's continue. So variable types, categorical variables arise or come from descriptive responses to questions, all kinds of questions. What kind of advertising do you like? Do you invest in stock market? Where do you shop? Questions like this are category or descriptive responses to questions and may only have two possible values like yes or no. So you have done this in the survey. So if you look back at the survey that you have done, this is exactly what it is. And also maybe a number like a telephone area code, in this case not. So examples of categorical variables, there you go. We did the first one. Now, some quantitative variables have units. So the unit, now this is totally different than what you just saw. The units indicate how each value has been measured, the corresponding scale of measurement, how much of something we have, how far apart two values are, also number of visits to a website, and these have no units, or number of shares, or have no such as number of visits to a website, and number of shares of a company traded in the Toronto Stock Exchange, let's say. Now, some variables can be both categorical and also quantitative. So this is how data are classified, depends on why we are collecting the data. It's always about why. For example, variable age is obviously the quantitative value measured in years. That may be used for finding the average age of customers, right? Just like in the little test that we did, you can have the average of your shoe size, let's say. So age categories such as child, teen, adult, or senior can be the category value used to decide in which music to offer a special deal. In this case, you know, what's listed here. So that way you can have age in categorical and also quantitative. There's also counts. In gathering data, we often count things. Counts can be used in two ways: to summarize categorical variables, which we just saw, and to measure the amount of things. So let's say a company may count the number of purchases shipped by different means to summarize the categorical variable shipping method. Here is an example. So shipping methods, you have ground, second day air, and overnight, and the number of purchases based upon the shipping method. Now, we also have, when we come to variable types, identifiers. So an identifier variable is a unique identifier assigned to each individual or item in a group. For example, social insurance numbers, student ID numbers, tracking numbers, and so on. Now, identifiers or identifier variables are special kind of categorical variables. They do not have units, are so useful in combining data from different sources to avoid duplication, and are not variables to be analyzed. Next is other types of data or data types, right? Categorical variables used only to name categories are sometimes called nominal variables, nominal. When data values can be ordered, we say that the variable has ordinal values. For example, employees can be ranked according to the number of days worked in the company, ordinal. Continue. We may differentiate quantitative variables according to whether they are measured. Values have a defined value for 0. For example, 80 Fahrenheit is not twice as hot as 40 Fahrenheit because 0 is an arbitrary value. So data without a defined value for 0 are said to be on an interval scale. Otherwise, they are said to be on a ratio scale. A lot of terms. Now, there's also cross-sectional and time series data. So variables that are measured at regular intervals over time are called time series. So for example, the share price of the Royal Bank of Canada at the end of each day for the past year is time series. That is a variable, right? Regular intervals over time, over every day, right? So when several variables are all measured at the same point in time, the data is called cross-sectional data. For example, collecting data on sales, revenue, number of customers, and expenses totaled over the past month at each Starbucks location is cross-sectional data. Now we have primary and secondary data, which we already saw and studied in other courses. So primary data are data we collect ourselves that our researchers have a very clear idea of the meaning of the data they collect from surveys, since they themselves design the wording of every question in those surveys and conduct the interview. So what you did was primary data when you did your survey. Secondary data are collected by another party, for instance, Statistics Canada. So it is very important to read all the guidelines and footnotes provided in order to get a precise idea of what the secondary data mean. You know what the primary data mean, but you don't know what the secondary mean based upon who or whom has collected it. Now, when and where data are collected can be important. So values recorded in 1803 may seem something different from similar values recorded last year, but values measured in Tanzania may differ in meaning from similar measures made in Mexico, right? Now, this is the when and the where. Now, how data are collected can make the difference between insight and nonsense. For example, data that comes from a voluntary survey on the internet are almost always worthless, right? However, data provided by agencies and businesses via the internet can be extremely useful. The how can be different between the insight and the nonsense. Also, talking about the where, how, and when, data can be found by performing an experiment and actively manipulating variables. Also by purchasing from the public or private agencies and by searching on the internet. Now, what can go wrong, right? What can go wrong? Don't label a variable as categorical or quantitative without thinking about the data and what they represent. What are you going to use it for? Don't automatically assume variables that are numbers are also quantitative. We saw that before. Always be skeptical. In other words, always ask yourself a second question. Understand the context of the data and look for bias in how the data were collected. We talked about bias right through the course. I mentioned bias constantly. And when you do statistics and surveys and all kinds of statistics that you gather and want to use based upon secondary data, especially even your primary data, you've got to be attentive to bias in yourselves and whomever has done the collection of data. What have we learned? Well, we've learned that data are information gathered in a specific context. We always take in consideration the 5 W's: who, what, why, where, and when. You can also use how. Help nail down the context of the data. We must know at least the who, what, and why to be able to say anything useful based on the data. Okay? So the who are the cases, the what are the variables, and why help us decide which way to treat the data. take in consideration the little exercise that you had to do, and in context, try to answer those type of questions to make an understanding of the actual information that you gather. Now, again, continue on what we have learned. We've learned that data can be divided into quantitative, categorical, cross-section or time series, and prime and secondary. Categorical variables identify a category for each case. Quantitative variables record measurements or amounts of something and include units, quantitative units. Variables can be categorical or quantitative, as we saw, depending on what we want to learn from them. Identifier variables are category variables that name each case. So this is it for chapter 2. A lot of information, which is very interesting information, but this is the base of statistics methods and in business. So you will have to understand the terminology that we've used so far to go ahead in this course. Thank you.